All right, welcome. Today, we are diving deep into one of the hottest topics in the business world, ESG. It feels like it's absolutely everywhere, right? But what is the research actually telling us? Let's find out. Okay, just take a look at this chart. The academic interest in environmental, social, and governance issues hasn't just grown, it has completely exploded. It's pretty wild. An incredible 84% of all ESG studies have been published just since 2016. We're talking about a tidal wave of information here. So that massive wave of data brings up some pretty big questions, doesn't it? With literally thousands of studies floating around, what are the real takeaways? What are the big debates that are raging? And maybe most importantly, where is this whole field of study even going? That's exactly what we're here to unpack. So first up, let's try to get a handle on the sheer scale of this research explosion and, why it's actually become a bit of a problem. Now, before we get any further, let's do a super quick refresher just so we're all on the same page. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. You can think of it as a report card for a company that grades it not just on profits, but on its real-world impact. And while having all this new research is awesome, it's also created a new problem. The landscape has become incredibly fragmented and, well, confusing. With so many studies and a lot of them with conflicting results, it's really hard to see the forest for the trees. So how in the world do you make sense of a maze like that? Well, you need a map. And it turns out some researchers have been busy drawing one for us. Our guide on this journey is a 2024 paper from Esposito de Falco and their team. Their mission was pretty straightforward, but really ambitious. Cut through all that noise and bring some much-needed clarity to this tangled web of research. So how they do it? They use this really powerful technique called bibliometric analysis. Now, think of it like creating a family tree, but for ideas. They didn't just read the articles. They mapped out all the connections, which ideas were cited the most, and how different streams of research influenced one another. It's a way to see the hidden skeleton of an entire field of study. And they didn't just wing it either. Their approach was super methodical. They followed this rigorous 5-step process. First, figure out the scope, then design the whole analysis, collect all the data, process it, and finally, analyze the results to actually build their map. And this is the payoff. What they found wasn't just a random mess of dots. The analysis revealed this beautifully clear structure, 4 totally distinct clusters. For our journey, we're going to call them the 4 continents of ESG research. All right, let's explore each of these 4 continents one by one so we can really understand the core questions that are driving the entire ESG world. Our first stop is the continent of disclosure. This is all about a simple question. What actually happens when companies start reporting on their ESG activities? So researchers digging around here are asking, what are the real-world effects of all this ESG reporting? Well, on the one hand, a lot of studies show it can have a real positive financial impact. We're talking better returns and cheaper loans. Plus, it can give a company's reputation a nice boost. But, and this is a big but, there's a catch. It also opens the door for greenwashing, where companies just talk a big game without actually doing anything meaningful. Next up, we're traveling to the continent of sustainability and performance. This one gets right to the very heart of the entire ESG idea. This whole area is basically defined by the great doing well by doing good debate. The big question is, does being a good corporate citizen actually make you more money? And it turns out the research is totally split. Lots of studies say, yes, there's a clear positive link, but just as many others say, it's complicated. They find either no real link or sometimes even a negative one. It often boils down to how you're measuring performance and over what period of time, which suggests there might be some really tough trade-offs involved. Our third continent takes us into the world of accounting. This is where we get into the real nuts and bolts of how ESG is measured and reported. Right, this is where the numbers really come into play. The research here gets into the nitty-gritty of how you actually measure things like climate risk or gender diversity on a board. And a huge finding in this area came from a massive review back in 2015. It analyzed hundreds of studies and found an overwhelmingly positive link between ESG and financial performance. This continent also looks at the growing power of big investors like pension funds, who are really pushing companies to take this stuff seriously. And that leads us perfectly to our final destination, the continent of responsible investments. This is all about looking at ESG from the investor's side of the table. So here, the big questions are for the investors themselves. Do these socially responsible portfolios actually make more money? Well, the results are pretty mixed, partly because every fund seems to define socially responsible a little differently. And a huge theme here is something we could call ratings roulette. Researchers are really worried because the ESG ratings from different agencies can be all over the place, wildly inconsistent, which makes it almost impossible for an investor to know who to trust.
So, we've toured the 4 major continents of ESG research. We've seen the debates and the discoveries, but where does all this go from here? What's next?
Well, the biggest takeaway of all is that these 4 continents are not isolated islands. As you can see in this framework, they're all deeply connected. What happens with company disclosures directly impacts investors. What those investors demand then shapes accounting practices. And all of that feeds right back into that big debate on performance. It's all one big ecosystem.
And having this map of the present really helps us chart a course for the future. Researchers are now tackling that next wave of big, tough questions. In disclosure, it's all about fighting greenwashing. In sustainability, it's about figuring out those tricky trade-offs. In accounting, it's about defining what real ESG leadership looks like. And for investments, it's about finally solving that massive problem of conflicting ratings. You know, all of this research, all of these intense debates, it all really boils down to one single provocative question. As ESG gets more and more woven into the fabric of our economy, is it going to be a force that genuinely changes how companies behave? Or will it just change the reports they write? That is the question that the next decade of research is going to have to answer.